Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to our presentation today. We are all kind of like working on aspects of this this grant that we received. And so we're really, really lucky to have people from the UNM Online and then also Jonathan Wheeler to talk about accessibility today. Um, so here's our agenda. We're going to start off with some universal design and then go into accessibility. We have lots of resources and then we'll sum it all up at the end. So, oopsies, here we go. Okay, so this slide, I wanted to just go ahead and tell you a little bit about why we're here today, like most specifically. So at UNM, we have our OER initiative, and we got a grant to create a consortium with two other colleges, Central New Mexico Community College and then Santa Fe Community College. And so a bunch of those folks are creating materials or adopting OER this semester. So we wanted to make like a workshop series for them to get started with OER, but then we also figured it would be great to just like invite other people too, like from across the state who might want to learn about like what we're doing and like how to apply some of these tools. So this specific workshop is about accessibility. And I was wondering, let me see. Okay, polls. I have a poll. I'm going to launch it. So how comfortable are you with creating accessible digital resources? You have choices, you're a newbie, you know some stuff, you feel proficient, but you want to be an expert, or you're an expert and you're just here for the snacks. I love snacks. I wish we All right. So we have, let me see how many people are in here. We have 16 people in here, and more than half of you have answered. So this is great. Thank you all for being here. Um, we're going to go ahead and have the chat open so you can post questions in the chat. Um, and then we'll definitely have a question session at the end. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. Oops. You know what? I'm just going to have trouble with this all day. So the presenters for today are Melissa Herrera, and I got your title from your email signature. I hope that's good. So she is
Yes,
the
that's correct.
experience and instructional designer at UNM Online, and she's very involved with OER at UNM. There's Jonathan Wheeler also, and he's a graduate and faculty engagement coordinator in the library. He's also an associate professor and knows lots of stuff about research data. And then my name's Jennifer Jordan. I am the OER librarian at UNM, and I'm an assistant professor. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh my gosh, there. Woohoo. So I'm going to toss it over to Melissa. Is this the right slide?
Yes, it is. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Most importantly, I hope that the information that we're providing is informative. And before we get started, I just wanted to give everybody an overview. It seems like most of us are proficient, but it's always good to go back and think about why we want to develop accessible content. So online learning has become a very big thing in higher education. We are seeing more students prefer online courses, at least um, some of the data that I've seen, at least students are taking at least one class, one online course. So we want to make sure that the content that we're providing in an online environment is accessible to everyone. Um, I wanted to share this graph right here that's on the screen. This is from the General Accountability Office. And one of the things that you'll notice here is that we have also seen an increase in higher education students with disabilities. So we want to make sure, again, that we're providing equal opportunities for students to have access to the content that you're providing, and not just for accessibility, but also just in general to make sure that we're providing different avenues for students to um, engage with content, to make connections. So oftentimes when we hear about the word accessibility, we automatically think about students with disabilities, and that's not always the case. I'll give you a really good example here. Um, we have this image, and most of us are able to interpret it, correct? Just by looking at it. But if we want additional context, it might be worthwhile to provide some more information. Like you'll see here on the right, it gives an explanation of the graph, explaining the numbers and why it's important. So again, providing different avenues for students to make connections to learning is very important. So one of the key takeaways, and I'll emphasize this very often, is we want to make sure that we are designing, uh, ex we're designing with accessibility in mind from the very beginning. Again, not just for the purposes of accommodating students with disabilities, but viewing it as an opportunity for everyone to access content and be able to um, make learning possible. So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So I want you all to just take a moment to look at these two examples. Which of these two, which example looks a lot better for you visually to read? Example one or example two? So far I'm seeing two. If anyone wants to chime in, why does example two look better than example one? Headings, bulleted list, exactly. See how those, just adding those pieces that we often view as, requirements, adding headings and bullets, um, make a difference in how we are displaying our information to our readers. It really does make a difference. It's again going back to that idea that it's not just benefiting a small group of users. Ultimately, it makes it a lot easier for all of us to comprehend the content, able to discern and go um, through a page and be able to understand. Okay, here's where I'm going to find the reading. Here's where I'm going to find the activities, and it makes it a lot easier for everyone to read. So again, really think about designing with accessibility in mind. Go ahead and go on to the next slide, Jennifer. Another reason that we want to design with accessibility in mind is also from a compliance standpoint, and I really don't want to scare anyone or make it seem like, this is the reason why we want to make content accessible. But one thing I did want to bring to everyone's attention is beginning in April of 2026, there are some updates to the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title II, and it's going to require state entities and local governments since we are technically a state entity, we do fall under this. We want to make sure that our digital content is accessible. And we're not just talking about making online courses accessible. We're talking about websites. We're talking about applications. We're talking about documents and things that students fill out, anything that's done um, through a mobile device. Anything that's in a digital space has to be accessible to students. So we want to make sure, again, that as we're designing our content, we're keeping this in mind. We want to make sure that we're being proactive and that we're not waiting, till 2026 to make sure that your content is in compliance. So again, another reason why we want to make sure that your content is accessible is to make sure that we're meeting um, our compliant or yeah, our obligations to compliance, but most importantly, that we are providing students with different opportunities to make learning happen for them. You can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So again, just a reemphasis, and you're going to see this very often throughout the presentation, always design with accessibility in mind. And for the next couple of minutes, we're just going to do an overview of some different things that you want to consider as you're designing your content. And I'm going to pass it off to John, and he's going to talk about universal design for learning.
Right. Yes. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's good to see such a nice turnout and some familiar faces and some new faces. And again, I'm John Wheeler. I'm the data curation librarian here, and I work with the graduate and faculty engagement team. And my experience with OER open educational resources, comes largely from my experience teaching coding and programming in-person and online environments to learners with a variety of backgrounds. And so although I'm not producing text as such, we produce a lot of notebooks, computational resources, and our work is guided by this notion of universal design. And Jennifer, if you can go ahead and switch to the next slide, thank you. Oh, one back. And it's this idea that moving away from accommodation, especially in online environments and in-person environments, and how do we create text and how do we create learning materials, but also how do we structure the learning environment in a way that supports users so that they can have the most beneficial experience. And moving away, as Melissa has already said a couple of times, moving away from this idea of accommodation to being as inclusive as we possibly can in how we design our learning interactions and the materials that we teach with. And so I'm not going to read this slide point for point, but it's just this idea of universal design, which is out in the design world and has been applied in this universal design and learning context, which, as noted here, it's really learner focused, right? It's focused on emphasizing the agency of individual learners, groups of learners, to engage with material, to have learning experiences that are purposeful, that give them opportunities to reflect and to grow, that help build resilience through authentic interactions and active learning and ability to participate and contribute. And what I really enjoy is this quote from Alexander Den Heyer, who I think sums it up, who's a design expert. When a flower doesn't bloom, we don't fix the flower, right? We fix the environment in which the flower grows. And and you can go ahead and switch to the next slide, Jennifer. We wanted to talk about universal design and learning, not as in itself a set of concrete strategies, because Melissa's going to get into those in the rest of the presentation, but just as a set of overarching guiding principles for how we can think about open pedagogy and open pedagogical practices and ways that we can establish and develop pedagogical materials that are as accessible as possible, right? Because when content is accessible, it benefits everyone and not just for learners with disabilities, right? And I'm not going to read through this graph point for point. It's available online from the CAST group, and a lot of my thinking on this is informed by the Carpentries, which is a global community that focuses on teaching computational and data management skills to learners from a variety of backgrounds. And everything we do is informed by these concepts. And so you can have access to these materials, but what we want to talk about are kind of these 3 points that we want to make sure that learners have multiple ways that they can receive information, engage with that information, and share it. And so we see here that in addition to being welcoming and inclusive, which is very much an environmental thing, like having a code of conduct within your classrooms and sticking with that code of conduct, doing things that can help build learners' emotional capacity by presenting materials, presenting exercises, tasks, assignments in a way that help them develop a growth mentality, right? This idea that you don't have to be born with the skill to write a novel or write a computer program. These are skills that can be developed through practice and feedback, right? And so building that emotional capacity and that resilience in our learners. Multiple means of representation, right? Different ways that they can engage with the content. One of the ways we do this in the Carpentries and in the workshops that I teach is we have something on the screen, we say exactly what's on the screen. If we're typing something, we say exactly what we type. We put the code that we're typing in a separate document, in a Google document, or something that learners can access online so they can see it, they can hear it, they can refer to it in a different place. There's multiple ways for them to engage with that content. And again, through assessment, through discussion, through conversation, we really try to structure our learning experiences so that learners have multiple ways that they can share their understanding, reflect on their understanding, and really engage with the material in a way that's action-oriented and meaningful for them. And so, again, a very high-level overview of an underlying concept that informs our practice in open education throughout. And now I'm going to pass it back to Melissa to talk more about how we apply these in terms of accessibility and open education. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So thank you for that wonderful recap on UDL, and we'll talk a little bit more about UDL and some of the strategies that we can implement. So what I'd like to share with you, and actually before we get started, because we do have such a variety of folks that feel proficient in implementing and making sure that content is accessible, we want to hear from you. Like, what are some resources that you're using? Jennifer is going to provide a link to a Padlet, and we hope that this is a good resource for you to take away, throughout the presentation as you're thinking about some of these things. Like, oh, we use Adobe Acrobat Pro for tagging, for example. So feel free to share out any resources that you feel are very helpful in helping you ensure that you're designing with accessibility in mind. So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide, unless you want to share some of the resources, Jennifer. I'm not sure. Okay. So besides universal design for learning, there's a couple of other things you want to consider, especially if you're designing digital content. I mentioned earlier that due to the updates to ADA, there are certain standards that we have to meet. The standards that ADA decided would be helpful in ensuring that digital content is accessible is known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. So as higher ed institutions across the state, we are responsible to making sure that we're meeting these standards. I'm going to provide a link to the standards. Give me just a moment. As you're looking at them, take them with a grain of salt, because they are very technical and they are not user friendly. But if you are wanting to dive in and learn more, here is all of the information that you need. We are not going to cover all of the standards. And some of them, in all honesty, do not apply to some of the digital content you're creating. So yeah, not very easy to read. So I'm going to try to make this, a lot more digestible as we're going through this. And if you have questions or anything like that, like, feel free to ask as we're going through this. But there are 4 principles that make up these standards. The first one is making sure that digital content is perceivable. We want to make sure that we're providing users with different ways to access the information. A good example is, if you're using images, you're providing a text description or some alternative text to making sure that users can perceive the information that's being provided through an image. The second principle is making sure that digital content is operable. And this is more, for like third-party tools and things like that. There are, making sure that users can navigate through a page without any issues. The reason why headings and bulleted lists are very important, because they do ensure that content is organized. But some of the other things that you'll notice with WCAG, it really does relate to like the actual technical software. But for us, as we're designing digital content, think of it as how we're organizing our content to make sure that users can navigate through it. So if you're designing something in Pressbooks, the use of headers, making it easy for students to navigate will be very important. The third principle is making sure that content is understandable. So again, just making sure that the information is easy for users to read and understand, that you're being consistent. I think this is the most important thing out of this principle is the consistency of pages. If you're designing an online course, you want to follow a consistent structure. You want to use the same language and terms throughout your course. So the same thing as if you're designing something, for example, in Pressbooks, you want to be consistent in how you're organizing content and also how you're referring to specific things in your work. And finally, the last principle is making sure that content is robust. We want it to be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a variety of users. And that, of course, includes users that use screen readers. So again, when we're tagging things in documents and, identifying headers, providing alternative text, that is very important for um, providing avenues for users that might rely on assistive technologies like a screen reader. You can go ahead and go on to the next slide. The other thing that you want to consider besides, designing an accessible learning environment and also designing content in a way that it is accessible is making sure that, you're keeping in mind usability. So usability applies to everyone. And I really like this definition that was provided. When we're talking about usability, it's all about how you can easily and effectively people can accomplish their goals using a product or system while having a positive experience. So when I think of usability, ultimately it's, think of it as like the user experience. Uh, we're designing for students, so I like to refer to it as the student experience. Are we providing, different avenues for students to access content? So the way that I view it, and here's a really good example. I like to, the how I connect accessibility and usability because it kind of seems synonymous. But I view accessibility as the foundation of a building, putting the structure, making sure that there's different avenues uh, for people to go into a building. And then you have uh, the structure, which is the usability, having doors and open spaces and, uh, you know, stairs and things like that that make it accessible and easy for, people to walk in and out of the building and, um, make it comfortable for everyone. Okay, you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Um, Now, the reason that we brought up UDL and WCAG and usability is because these are three things that you want to keep in mind. As you're designing content, of course, the first thing that you want to focus on is making sure that that you're providing different avenues for learning to take place. That's where universal design for learning comes into play. So we want to apply UDL principles. The next thing that we want to do is think about how can everyone access this? So keeping the web content accessibility guidelines in mind is very important. We want to make sure that we're implementing some of those standards within our digital content and to ensure that everything is working as it should be. We want to review content before it's being published, and there's where that usability comes in. Are we providing a positive experience for our users? And I'll provide a couple of different resources for how to ensure that your content is usable and it's going to provide a positive experience. So again, thinking about how we can make learning positive, how we can make content accessible, and verifying that the content you know, is going to provide a good experience is very important. Um, and the next couple of slides will kind of go into different considerations for each of these three principles that we're talking about this morning. You can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So like we mentioned earlier, here's some considerations if you're thinking about how to make learning accessible and easy for everyone. So when we're talking about multiple means of engagement, you know, there are things that you can do such as, stating the learning goals, providing examples, Maybe you want to add some reflection prompts, especially if you're providing lots of content. It is a good opportunity to add uh, some knowledge checks or some different activities that allow your users to reflect on what was provided. When you're thinking about multiple means of representation, this is where, when we're thinking about how do we make an image accessible to everyone, providing alternative text, providing a longer description and describing an image can be very helpful. Maybe you want to provide videos. Oftentimes, we want to explain abstract concepts and it is very difficult to process in text. So try to provide, videos and images to ensure that your learners can make better sense of what they've learned, through reading text and things like that. You might also consider providing interactive learning activities, non-graded multiple choice questions, flashcards, um, anything that's interactive, anything that allows learners to think about and process, have that opportunity to process information is very important and allows them to think about like, hey, I understand what I've read, or maybe I need to go back and read based on, going through these learning activities. And finally, for multiple means of action and expression, you know, sometimes providing supplementary resources can be very beneficial. Um, it can provide opportunities for deeper learning. It can serve as interventions in some ways for students who maybe struggling with understanding the content. And it also offers opportunities to practice and review content, especially as they're preparing for exams and things like that. So there's a lot of different strategies that you can utilize to ensure that learning is accessible to everyone. But these are just some things to keep in mind if you're wanting to design with accessibility with a focus on the learning environment. Next slide. Now, if we're thinking about more of the technical aspect of our content, the way that it's structured, maybe you're wanting to thinking about implementing the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Here's a couple, and some of these I will go into further detail in the next few slides, but some things that you might want to consider is the way that you organize content. We saw in our example at the beginning of the workshop, adding headings makes a huge difference. Adding bulleted lists makes content visually appealing and a lot more easier to digest. Providing alternative text for images is very important. And I'll talk more about these two in a little bit. Not relying on color to convey information. Sometimes we try to use, red, like a red font or a bolded font. And, sometimes that's just not, for some users, they're not going to be able to see that or understand it. So think about different ways to convey information without the use of color. If you're using videos, you want to make sure that they're accurate, that they're synchronized. I know that a lot of us tend to use YouTube videos, which is, YouTube is a great resource, but, just providing auto caption or auto generated captions is not sufficient. We want to make sure that they're synchronized and that they're accurate. So making sure that you take time if you are using videos to update captions and things like that. If you are at UNM, you have resources to do that through Kaltura. I'm sure that there are other software programs out there that do the same thing. I know Panopto is one of them. So I believe NMSU is the one that uses Panopto. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. But, there are different tools that will allow you to update captions or provide accurate transcripts of videos. Other things that you want to do is provide meaningful link descriptions. And a really good example, one of the examples that I always use is think about the students that use screen readers. If you're providing a long URL uh, in in your digital content, if a student with a screen reader is listening to it, they're going to have to listen to that entire URL being read to them. And oftentimes, it doesn't really even provide any context as to what you're clicking as a visual user. So you want to make sure that you're providing um, meaningful link description. Other things that you want to consider, and I won't talk about this one in this workshop. There is another workshop where there's going to be a deeper dive into accessibility. But something to keep in mind if you're using tables is you want to make sure that you're using it to present data. I often see instructors use tables for decorative purposes, and you really want to try to stay away from that because ultimately tables should be used to present data uh, more than anything. And finally, we want to make sure that font size is legible. So you want to make sure that, the font size is not small, you know, is readable for everyone, that it's not small because, you know, if you want your users to look at your content, you want to make sure that, everyone's able to read it and they're not having to squint or uh, having to use the magnifying glass on their browsers to read content. So these are just some considerations to properly meet web content accessibility guidelines. In the next few slides, I will talk a little bit more about some of these considerations. So you can go ahead and go on to the next slide, Jennifer. So one of the ones that I wanted to talk about this morning was is making sure that we're using headers appropriately. So, and I used to do this as well. I used to use, I thought just bolding and increasing the font size was sufficient to serve as a header. But realistically, it's not. We want to make sure that, again, for users that use screen readers, it's not going to tell them if it's a header unless it's properly tagged as such. So if you're using, for example, Pressbooks, you want to use the hierarchies that you see here, some examples. So, you want to start with heading 1 to represent, a title or the most important idea on the page, and then use a consistent structure going on to header 2 and then header 3 and so on and so forth. So you want to make sure that you know, if this is something that you're new to using, getting used to these headers is very important. If you're developing content through Microsoft Tools, the text editor will have right in the middle is the option for you to select different headings. Um, I know not everyone uses Canvas, but here at UNM, we're using Canvas. So those of you who are designing digital content in Canvas, the rich content editor will allow you to update headings. Um, and you don't have to keep the headings just the way that they're defaulted. You can change them and increase the font size or decrease the font size, but we want to make sure that they are tagged properly as a heading to provide that additional information to users who need it. You can go on to the next slide. And thank you, Jennifer. I think that is a really good point to make. Using appropriate headings also helps the writer think about the organization of content. That is a really good point. It just makes it a lot easier to go through, especially if you're designing an ebook and Pressbooks. Knowing where content begins and where it ends is very important. And now, as far as alternative or accessible image, excuse me, here's some things you want to consider. So we want to add helpful descriptions, and we refer to these as alternative text in any images that are important. You'll notice that there are some images that you use for decorative purposes, and those you can mark as such. They don't have to have alternative text. So you really have to decide like which images are important, which are they conveying additional information through text or that's being provided in a text? And making sure that if you're creating alternative text, it doesn't have, at least for the alternative text, you just want to try to describe the image like if you were talking to someone over the phone. Now, if your image requires, like a very long, lengthy description, then that shouldn't go in the actual image itself. You should probably include it in your text. So, for example, charts or graphs, those are simply saying a map of, uh, map of the United States, it might be okay. Or let's say that you're using, going back to the example that I provided earlier, if you're providing a bar graph, simply saying a bar graph of students with disabilities is not enough. You need to be able to provide additional information. So for things that require a lot more explanation, it is important that you integrate that into your text, not just as a form of alternative, not just adding it as a alternative text. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So here's a really good example, and I took this from the UNMOER faculty guide. I think this is a really good example of what good alternative text looks like, and then an example of bad alternative text. So the bad alternative text says that this is an image of outer space. If I were a user that was not able to see this image, I don't think I could imagine what outer space looks like. But NASA did a really good job of providing this descriptive alternative text, and I'll let you all, skim through it, but it provides a really good description of this image. So you want to be very intentional with the alternative text that you're providing. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So those are the three considerations, or excuse me, WCAG considerations that I wanted to touch a little bit more on. If you have any questions about any of the other WCAG standards, feel free to ask. We will be having another workshop where we're doing a deeper dive into some of these things with more examples. But, if there's anything that you're like, I really want to learn more about this, let us know. And that can be something that we can address in our next workshop. But these are just, to get you started. And we will provide you with different resources of some of the things that I've provided as examples. Now, if you feel like you're comfortable, you have a really good learning environment, you feel like you've implemented, different or multiple means of representation, you feel like more or less have all of the WCAG stuff um, ready, they look good. Now, to ensure that to ensure that the content is accessible to everyone, there are some usability um, programs out there that you can use to test your content. So for example, there's accessibility checkers within some of the software programs that we use. If you're using Word or any of the Office programs, Microsoft has their own accessibility checker, which will tell you, hey, here's what you need to fix. If you're providing PDF in your content, Adobe Acrobat Pro also has an accessibility checker that will tell you everything that you need to fix. And we'll probably do a deeper dive into tagging because that is something that you'll definitely notice if you are checking your PDF for accessibility, is making sure that you're tagging content correctly. For some learning management systems, you may have access to Ally. Here at UNM, we have access to Ally. If you're a Blackboard Ultra user, you have access to Ally, and that's their, that's a way to determine if your content is accessible or not. So if you see a little red gauge, for example, in Canvas for your documents, then that means you might need to do a little bit of work on fixing the content to make sure that it's accessible. And then, of course, Canvas also has an accessibility checker built in. Now, if you're wanting to test your content to see how it might work with a screen reader, there's a couple of different ways to do that. NVDA is a free screen reader that you can download. It's great. I tend to use it very often to do a lot of my testing with screen readers. You can also use JAWS. That's a licensed product that I know a lot of students use at different institutions. Um, you can also use Speaker, which is the Microsoft version of a screen reader that they've provided. So, there's different ways or there's different programs out there that you can use as a screen reader to test your content out. Now, if you're wanting to check the accessibility of a web page or even a page within Pressbooks, there's different web accessibility tools. So far, the only ones that I have used and that are free are called Wave and Andy. I caution the use of these just because they tend to be very technical. So if you're not a web developer, some of this might seem a little overwhelming or complex, but it at least gives you an idea of, figuring out if, your page is accessible or not. So it's worthwhile to test out and, figure out what areas of your web pages need to be updated and to ensure, that they meet those web content accessibility guidelines. All right, so you can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Sorry, this is the other thing that I wanted to talk about. So for another consideration in terms of usability is color contrast. Um, so a wonderful resource that I use very often to check that color is accessible is through WebAIM. I highly recommend WebAIM as a resource. I put the link in the chat to the contrast checker. But WebAIM does a really good job of providing a more user-friendly description of those web content accessibility guidelines. There's a lot of different examples of, how to meet the standards and things like that. But they have some really handy resources, um, like the color contrast checker that you see here. Here's an example. I used our cherry red color to see if it's accessible or not. The only one it didn't pass was level 3. We don't have to worry about a level 3 as long as we're meeting this level 2. We're good. But we want to make sure that when we're thinking about colors, like I mentioned earlier, that we're not using it as the only way to convey information. You might need if you're requiring somebody to fill out a form, adding an asterisk or adding words like required can be very helpful. But this is like a really good resource, to test out, if you're wanting to add a little bit of color and you want to make sure that it's accessible, this is a really good resource to make sure that, that those colors complement each other and that there aren't any issues. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. And here's just a list of resources that I wanted to provide to everyone. So I've already provided the WebAIM color contrast checker, the WebAIM checklist. If you want to learn more about the web content accessibility guidelines, there's a checklist, and I'm going to add the link in the chat for everyone.
And I know someone who works at Chemeketa Community College. They have a lot of OER programming over there.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome because I really love the checklist that they've created. They've designed it with, WCAG in mind, and I added the link in the chat. So this is a really good checklist. If you want to, use it to ensure that your content is accessible and meets WCAG. I think they've done a phenomenal job of telling you exactly like what are some things you want to consider for your digital content. Penn State and Illinois State also has some fantastic how-tos that I use. For example, the link that I'm going to share in the chat is from Illinois State, and they have wonderful wonderful how-tos for how to tag documents in Adobe Acrobat Pro. So if you want to learn more about how to do that, they offer some really good resources. Like I mentioned, Penn State has some really cool explanations, more user-friendly explanations of how to meet some of the standards. And so does the Section 508 website, which is um, from the US government. They have some really good resources and how-tos as well. They have a lot of different workshops and webinars if you want to learn more about how to, meet some of the standards or do certain things. They have a lot of wonderful resources as well and workshops. And Jennifer, I don't know if you want to provide the next resources.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide. So I just have this faculty OER guide that we created. Kiernan, who is here, took something that I made and helped to put it on this platform and researched a bunch on accessibility. So you can check out this guide. It's pretty much meant for people who are working on OER, kind of like diving into it, like the creators are this semester. And then we have also, this is a great book, Accessibility Toolkit, and I can stick that link in the chat too. But this is from British Columbia Open Campus, and they also have like a really robust collection of OER materials, and they also have this great toolkit. So this is a great guide to use as you're going along and developing your materials. And then oh, I found this too, the Flow project. This was really cool. But so it has a bunch of tools and guides for creating open content. They want to engage diverse learners, include more design. Wait, sorry, backwards. Anyway, so navigate to this side to find tools on open education that support inclusive learning and teaching. So the focus is open education and some of these concepts that we're talking about today. So I got really excited when I found that and I wanted to include it. But key takeaways. Who was gonna take this slide? Should
I can do it. I added this in here.
okay.
I know we provided a lot of information, and honestly, when we talk about accessibility, it seems very overwhelming because it's like, well, where do I begin? Where do I start? And I think the one thing, if anything that you take out of today's workshop, start small. Think about one thing that you want to improve in your digital content. I think the one thing I want to emphasize, like I said, you don't want to incorporate everything right away. If you want to focus on building a better learning environment that's accessible to everyone, then maybe think about looking back at some of the universal design for learning principles. If you're wanting to ensure that the content is accessible in the space that you're putting it in, whether it's Pressbooks, whether it's Canvas or any of the LMS, then maybe think about looking at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and, testing it out and using some of those usability tools, to ensure that it's accessible. So really think about, what is it that I can start to work on today and, build from that. So I don't want anyone to leave here feeling like, oh my goodness, I have to go back and fix everything. That's not the intention. Ultimately, we want you to begin to design, with ensuring, that content is accessible from the very beginning. But if you're already far along the ways, then go back and think about, how you can implement some of these considerations into your digital content. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of great workshops, a lot of webinars right now, especially with the ADA updates that are really focused on accessibility. I encourage you to take advantage of those. We will be having another workshop in April where we're doing a deeper dive into accessibility. I will be presenting along with one of my colleagues at UNM Online about the updates to ADA at NMOER, New Mexico Higher Education. Sorry, I don't know the full acronym.
Assessment too.
Again,
Assessment.
and retention, assessment and retention.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we will be presenting there. So if you want to learn more about um, the updates, we'll definitely talk about that. I'll probably share some of the things that I shared in this workshop as well. But yes, definitely take opportunities to learn more. Um, the next two I think are important, and ultimately this is where you need to gauge your users. You know, if you're in the process of wanting to publish, besides looking at accessibility checkers, have students look at your work. You know, get feedback from them. Tell them, what is it that's not working or what is working. Maybe figuring out like what are some of the things that students ask you often that they need accommodations for. They might ask you, we need better pictures because they look very pixelized, or higher quality scans, or videos need to be, you know figuring those things out can be very important and can help dictate how you want to increase the accessibility of your digital content. Regular testing. Thank you for those who have shared in the Padlet. I was looking at some of the responses, and using the accessibility checkers is very important. Use some of the tools that I provided, and making sure that you're providing a positive experience. And finally, again, don't view accessibility as only serving a small group of students. The implementation of the things that you integrate into your course design is important, and it's going to help students be successful. Even just those small changes that you make throughout your content can go a long ways and can make a difference for everyone. So really think about, when we're talking about accessibility, it's all about focusing on student success more than anything.
Oh, look at that. Look at that slide. I thought I was going to say questions. No, but so I wanted to let you all know that we're going to have an OER track at Tech Days, which is a conference at UNM, and it's free, and they will feed you lunch. And there are going to be cool sessions and workshops that you can check out. So it's kind of it revolves around tech, but there are some sessions that relate to teachers. And then the registration will open on March 7th. The OER track that we are creating is with people who've made materials through the NMOER consortium. And they're going to be presenting their materials and telling you how they use them, and then also sharing because their materials are already out there on the web. So they'll talk about how they use their materials. But I'm gonna go ahead and close this slide and then just see if there's any questions. Yeah, and thank you so much, Melissa and John, for coming and talking about these things. Yeah, and people did put some resources in the Padlet, so you can get to that in the chat. There's the link. Um, but Kieran talks about using accessibility checkers, different editors, closed captioning in YouTube. CNM will professionally caption all your courses if course videos if a student requests it. And then we also have embedded in our Canvas, there is a tool that can help you to create transcripts of videos, and that's what Melissa was talking about, Kaltura. But if you have a different LMS, you probably have some access to something like that. So you could contact your IT department and see like what they have available for you. But yeah, and so does Brightspace. So CNM uses Brightspace. I remember that.
I'll also add the resources that I provided into Padlet. So if you all want just like a one place where you can find everything, I'll make sure that they're in the Padlet as well.
We'll do that too. Thank you for that idea. So thanks everybody for coming. This was like a blown up version of an aspect of one presentation we did last semester. So we're taking all that we wanted to cover in one session, stretching it out across 4 different sessions. So I'll put the link up to or in the chat for the other workshops if you'd like to attend any of those. And if y'all thank you for coming.